October 6, 1943, Blackett Strait, Solomon Islands. The sea is black as tar, moonlight swallowed by clouds. A Japanese destroyer, Amagiri, cuts through the dark at 30 knots. 400 feet of steel, engines pounding, wake glowing faintly in the phosphorescent Pacific. The crew smokes on deck, relaxed. The night is theirs, or so they think. Then, radar contact. 800 yards off the port bow. Something small, something fast. Probably debris, someone mutters. But the radar return moves faster than anything that should be there. Suddenly, across the water, 3 streaks of white foam appear like claws tearing through the night. Torpedoes. And behind them, an 80-foot silhouette, charging head-on at 40 knots. The destroyer's guns open fire, but they're too slow. Within 90 seconds, the sea erupts. Explosions, screams, confusion. That night, everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about naval warfare was shattered, because the attackers weren't cruisers, they weren't submarines. They were patrol torpedo boats, plywood, gasoline, and raw American audacity. Small, expendable, and until now dismissed as nuisance weapons. But that night, the nuisance became a nightmare, and the age of big steel warships suddenly looked very old. The Japanese destroyers never expected it. They'd built for armor and artillery, not for speed, not for chaos. But at 40 knots, the rules of the sea no longer applied. When war came to the Pacific, America's shipyards were bursting with steel battleships, cruisers, destroyers. But none of those could fight the kind of war the islands demanded. The Navy needed something fast, something cheap, something that could fight in shallow waters and vanish before the enemy could react. So, engineers at Higgins Industries and Elko got to work. The result? A strange-looking 80-foot wooden boat that looked more like a speedboat than a war machine. It carried 4 torpedoes, a few machine guns, and a crew of just 12 men. The Navy called it the PT Patrol Torpedo Boat. The men who served on them called it something else, the plywood coffin. Early missions were disasters. The Mark 8 torpedoes misfired or ran too deep. Japanese destroyers spotted them too soon. And against armor plating, their wooden hulls splintered like matchsticks. Skeptics called them a publicity gimmick, something out of a Saturday matinee. Even within the Navy, destroyer captains joked, "Let the PT boys have their fun, they'll be gone before sunrise." But in Detroit, something was happening that would change all that. At Packard Motor Company, the same people who built engines for racing cars and P-51 Mustangs engineers were experimenting with a monster, a 12-cylinder marine engine capable of 1,350 horsepower. By mounting 3 of them side by side, the PT boat suddenly had a combined output of 4,050 horsepower. That's when plywood turned into a weapon. At full throttle, the new PTs could reach 41 knots, nearly 50 miles an hour on water. That was faster than any destroyer, faster than any Japanese escort ship, and fast enough to outrun even their own torpedoes. The Pacific had never seen anything like it. Now, the Americans had something that could strike at night, fade into darkness, and hit again before the enemy even knew what happened. But speed alone wasn't enough. To turn these fragile boats into destroyer killers, they needed new tactics, a new kind of warfare. That was coming next. Because while the Japanese relied on tradition and armor, the Americans were about to weaponize innovation. To understand why the Japanese destroyers never expected those 40-knot strikes, you have to step into the mindset of the Imperial Navy in 1942. Japan's naval doctrine was built on pride, the legacy of Tsushima, and the dream of decisive battle. Their fleet was an empire of giants, heavy cruisers, torpedo destroyers, and the magnificent battleships Yamato and Musashi. In that doctrine, small boats were toys, the kind of thing you used to guard a harbor or chase smugglers, not challenge the emperor's destroyers. Japanese officers laughed when they first heard about America's patrol torpedo boats. They called them mosquitoes, annoying but harmless. Reports described them as wooden boats with weak guns and unreliable torpedoes. "One hit," a Japanese captain joked, "and they will burn like kindling." It wasn't arrogance alone, it was calculation. Japanese destroyers could make 30 to 35 knots and carried armor, depth charges, and 5-inch guns. Their lookouts were trained to spot submarines, aircraft, or other destroyers, not 80-foot wooden ghosts running without lights in the middle of the night. Radar? Most Japanese ships didn't have it until late 1943, and even when they did, those early sets were blind to small, fast targets close to the water. So when PT boats began showing up in the Solomon Islands, Tokyo's intelligence reports downplayed the threat. Limited range, poor accuracy, little operational value. But what they didn't realize was that those wooden boats were evolving faster than anyone in the Pacific. The Americans learned. Every failed mission became a blueprint for the next ambush. Crews began coordinating their attacks in teams, one boat drawing fire, another circling wide for a torpedo strike. And by the time Japanese destroyers took notice, the PT squadrons had turned the night sea into a trap. The irony is cruel. Japan had built its war plan around one massive, decisive battle, but instead it was dying by 1,000 wooden cuts delivered at 40 knots under the cover of darkness. Speed was no longer just an advantage. It was a new kind of weapon, one Japan didn't even believe existed. Before the Pacific turned into a battlefield of speed, it began in the factories of Detroit. There, amid the roar of assembly lines and the smell of oil, America's automotive engineers were quietly rewriting the physics of naval warfare. The Packard Motor Car Company, best known for luxury automobiles, was tasked with building something no one had ever tried before, a high-performance aircraft-style engine that could survive salt water, combat vibration, and constant abuse at sea. The result was the Packard V-12 Marine engine. It was essentially the soul of an aircraft, adapted for water. Each 12-cylinder block produced 1,350 horsepower, and 3 of them together could hurl an 80-foot PT boat across open water at more than 40 knots. They were precise, temperamental, and beautiful, a mechanical symphony of raw power. But with that speed came danger. The boats ran on aviation-grade gasoline, highly explosive. A single tracer round could turn a PT into a floating fireball. And yet, every crewman accepted the risk, because with Packard engines behind them, they finally had something that could outrun death itself. One engineer described it this way: "We didn't just build engines, we built confidence." Every throttle push was a promise that our boys could get in and get out alive. Those engines weren't born in secret labs, they were built on the same production lines that once made family sedans. Detroit's factories became America's arsenal of velocity. Men who had never seen the ocean were now shaping the outcome of the Pacific War with wrenches, pistons, and innovation. When the first Packard-powered PT boats reached the Solomon Islands, the transformation was immediate. They could close distance, attack, and vanish before the Japanese destroyers could bring their guns around. And unlike the destroyers, which took years to build, these wooden boats could be produced in weeks, each powered by the heartbeat of American industry. It wasn't just an engine, it was a revolution, proof that technology, not tonnage, would define the new age of warfare. The Japanese still believed size equaled strength, but the men on those PT boats were about to prove that, in modern war, speed could kill. Speed alone couldn't win a naval war. It needed brains, coordination, and the kind of nerve that only came from men willing to fight within spitting distance of destroyers 10 times their size. That's where Lieutenant John D. Bulkley and his men came in. Bulkley, the kind of officer who preferred action over orders, commanded Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 inches the Philippines. He was restless, daring, and unafraid to improvise. Under his leadership, PT boat crews developed a new kind of warfare the Japanese had never seen before: the slash attack. Instead of charging head-on like traditional torpedo craft, the boats attacked in sections 2 or 3 at a time, striking from different angles. One boat would race directly toward the destroyer, its wake lit by tracer fire, deliberately drawing attention. While the enemy's guns swung toward that decoy, the others looped around unseen, closing to within 1,000 yards, close enough to smell the smoke, and fired their torpedoes almost point-blank. The Japanese gunners were trained to fight symmetrical battles, predictable, ordered by the book. The PT crews fought like street brawlers. They darted, vanished, reappeared, and struck again. It was chaos, and chaos favored the fast. Some crews even used deception. They'd cut engines to drift silently within range, letting the destroyer's searchlights pass overhead before roaring back to life. Others used the glow of burning wrecks or the moon's reflection to mask their approach. The Japanese called it yokai-sen, the ghost ships. They couldn't track them, couldn't hit them, and couldn't understand how such small craft could strike so hard. By 1943, PT boat squadrons had mastered night operations. They trained to read the sea by starlight alone, to navigate using nothing but compass headings and instinct. They didn't fight with radar superiority, they fought with audacity. The combination of Packard power and these hit-and-run tactics made them unpredictable, the one thing the Imperial Navy hated most, because in naval warfare, predictability meant death. Every engagement became a knife fight in the dark, fought at speeds that made old doctrines worthless. The Japanese had built their empire on the idea that war was a chessboard, but the Americans had just thrown the chessboard into the sea, and soon those new tactics would meet their ultimate test in the narrow, haunted waters of Blackett Strait. October 6, 1943. The Solomon Islands are a graveyard of ships. Locals call it Iron Bottom Sound, a name earned from the wrecks that litter its floor. That night, 4 American PT boats, PT-59, PT-157, PT-162, and PT-170 waited in ambush. Their mission: intercept Japanese destroyers running supplies down the Tokyo Express, the high-speed nighttime convoys that kept Japan's island garrisons alive. The sea was pitch black. Engines idled at low speed, barely whispering. Crews crouched at their guns, eyes straining for movement. Just after midnight, radar picked up faint echoes fast, powerful signatures slicing through the channel. Japanese destroyers. The Americans knew what that meant. Within minutes, searchlights and 5-inch shells would turn the night into daylight. But this time, the PTs didn't scatter. They attacked. Each boat accelerated, throttles wide open. The Packard engines screamed, tearing through the stillness. Spray hit the gunners' faces like needles. Within moments, they were closing at 40 knots, less than 800 yards from the lead destroyer. Tracer rounds lit the sea. The Japanese gunners fired blind, their shells splashing wildly behind the speeding boats. Then came the counterstrike. At 1,000 yards, PT-170 loosed its torpedoes, a spread of 4, slicing white wakes through the darkness. Seconds later, PT-162 joined in. 2 more torpedoes raced toward the target. A flash, then a thunderclap. One torpedo struck home amidships. The Japanese destroyer Yugure, 2,090 tons of steel, lifted from the water, broke apart, and began to sink. 26 minutes. That's all it took. For the first time, wooden boats had destroyed a fully armed Imperial destroyer in open combat. Radio silence filled the air. No one spoke for a full minute. Then someone broke it. "We got one. We actually got one. What had been dismissed as nuisance craft had just pulled off what cruisers and aircraft had failed to do for months. The victory stunned the Japanese High Command. Reports came back, calling it impossible. How could boats built of wood and gasoline outfight destroyers forged from the best steel in Japan? The answer was simple: speed, coordination, and nerve. But the consequences went deeper. Because from that night onward, every Japanese destroyer captain entering the Solomon Islands knew that the real danger didn't come from the air or from beneath the waves. It came from the black horizon, where 3 faint wakes might suddenly appear and vanish just as fast. That fear would soon change the entire rhythm of Japan's Pacific operations. By late 1943, the once proud Tokyo Express was running on dread. For nearly 2 years, Japanese destroyers had ruled the nighttime sea lanes between Rabaul and the Solomon Islands. They raced troops and supplies down the slot, using speed and darkness to outmaneuver Allied air power. But now, the hunters were being hunted. Every night, the sound of distant engines, faint, high-pitched, and unnatural, sent shivers through the watch crews of Japanese ships. 3 Packard engines, screaming at full throttle, were unmistakable. It was the sound of death on the water. At first, captains believed it was coincidence, bad luck, ambush, maybe radar error. But as more destroyers took damage, patterns emerged. Convoys that once made 6 or 7 runs a week were now cut to 2. Morale plummeted. In war diaries later recovered, Japanese officers wrote about untraceable enemy craft that appeared without warning and vanished like ghosts. Lookouts fired blindly into the night, sometimes hitting nothing but their own wakes. Some captains even began to refuse assignments through the slot, quietly claiming mechanical trouble to avoid the midnight gauntlet. Others ordered engines to half speed, hoping to listen for approaching PTs, a fatal mistake that made them easier targets for torpedo ambushes. The Imperial Navy, once the most disciplined force in the Pacific, was slipping into fear and superstition. One destroyer's log entry captured it best: "We fear not the great ships of America, but the small ones we cannot see." By the end of 1943, Japanese fleet commanders had begun diverting supply missions to slower, smaller barges, anything to avoid the narrow straits where PT squadrons roamed. But that retreat came at a heavy cost. Cut off from fuel, food, and ammunition, Japanese island garrisons began to starve. What the PT boats couldn't destroy outright, they strangled through isolation. And behind it all was the simplest equation in warfare. One American PT boat cost a few $1,000s and 12 men. One Japanese destroyer cost millions and a full crew of 200. The math no longer favored the empire. The wooden boats had changed the balance of power not through firepower but through fear. And as the Pacific tightened around Japan's supply lines, a new realization dawned: the most dangerous enemy wasn't always the biggest. It was the one that refused to fight by the old rules. In war, every weapon tells a story, not just of courage, but of arithmetic. And in that cold arithmetic, America had solved an equation Japan never could. A single Japanese destroyer took nearly 2 years to build. It required thousands of tons of steel, precision machinery, and a full naval shipyard. A single American PT boat took just 60 days. No dry dock, no armor plate, just plywood, screws, and horsepower. 70 PT boats could be built for the cost of one Japanese destroyer. It was industrial warfare reduced to its purest form: speed, simplicity, and scale. While Japanese shipyards clung to tradition, America treated war like an assembly line. Factories in Bayonne, New Jersey, and Bay City, Michigan churned out Elko and Higgins PT hulls around the clock. Each one identical, interchangeable, ready to be shipped to the Pacific in sections and reassembled by crews who sometimes hadn't even seen the ocean before. The miracle wasn't in the boats themselves, it was in the system that birthed them. Every part could be replaced, every engine swapped, every loss replaced faster than the enemy could recover. The Japanese Empire measured strength in tonnage, America measured it in throughput. For the Imperial Navy, every lost destroyer was a national wound. For the U.S. Navy, every lost PT boat was a line item, and by the next month, 3 more would arrive to take its place. That imbalance became a silent weapon all its own. Because even when a PT was sunk, its impact lingered in the fear it caused, in the ships it delayed, in the fuel it forced Japan to burn just to move at night. Japan had built a war machine of precision. America had built a war machine of abundance. And somewhere between those two philosophies, the Pacific began to tilt. In the end, it wasn't armor or artillery that decided the naval war. It was the ability to adapt faster, to build more, and to turn ideas into production. The PT boat was never meant to replace destroyers or cruisers. It was designed to make the enemy question every mile of ocean he sailed, and that, perhaps, was its greatest victory. It forced Japan's warlords to fight a kind of war they neither understood nor could afford. Behind every PT boat that sliced through the Pacific at 40 knots were 12 men barely more than boys, living on the edge of exhaustion and courage. They slept in cramped bunks that smelled of fuel and sweat. Every night, they knew one hit could turn their boat into a fireball. There were no armor plates, no escape hatches, and often no backup. Just faith in each other and the engines that roared beneath their feet. Letters from PT crews tell the story better than any report. One sailor wrote, "You don't think about dying out there. You think about holding the line long enough to make it back to base and hoping your engines keep singing." That song, the deep, growling roar of 3 Packard V-12 seconds, became the sound of defiance. For the Japanese, it was terror. For the Americans, it was home. But speed came with a cost. The stress of constant night patrols, the fumes, the vibration it wore down even the strongest men. Many developed chronic hearing loss, sleeplessness, and what they called nerves, the old word for trauma. In the Solomon Islands, PT crews were known for their haunted eyes. They'd stare out at the sea long after missions, replaying every close call, every flash of tracer fire, every scream carried by the wind. They were heroes in silence. Their victories rarely made front pages. There were no grand parades for men who fought in wooden boats, but they carried a reputation that even the enemy couldn't forget. Captured Japanese officers later admitted that destroyer captains began to pray before night runs, not against submarines or bombers, but against PT boats. One officer put it simply, "They came from nowhere, attacked with fury, and disappeared before we could even breathe." By the war's end, hundreds of PT boats had been built, and many never returned, but their influence reached far beyond the Pacific. They inspired generations of naval design, from fast attack craft to missile boats and coastal defense ships that still follow their blueprint today. And perhaps most remarkably, one young lieutenant from a PT boat named PT-109 would go on to change history in another way, a man named John F. Kennedy. He, too, learned what those boats taught everyone who ever sailed them, that courage isn't about armor or numbers, it's about facing the dark with speed, wit, and willpower, and never backing down. The story of the PT boats isn't just a story of engines or torpedoes, it's a story of imagination of men who looked at the Pacific and refused to play by its rules. The Japanese destroyers believed size was destiny. The Americans believed destiny could be built out of plywood and horsepower. And in that clash of belief, the unthinkable happened. The world's most powerful navy was humbled not by greater guns or thicker armor, but by boats small enough to fit inside its own gun barrels. The Imperial Japanese Navy never truly recovered from the psychological blow, because once fear enters doctrine, it never leaves. The PT boats proved something timeless. In warfare and in history, victory belongs not to the biggest, but to the fastest to adapt. When the last PT boat returned to harbor and its engines finally went silent, its legacy was already written across the waves. A reminder that courage, ingenuity, and speed can turn the tide of even the largest war, and that sometimes the smallest boats leave the deepest wakes.